So real quick before the video starts, if you guys enjoy my content, you want to see more from me, make sure to subscribe, and if you want to get notified every time I upload or go live, make sure to hit that notification bell as well. Out here spitting bars, bro. Anyway, today we're back on Miner's Haven, and today I'm going to be reviewing all of the new items that got added with the birthday event. I'm going to be taking a look at all of the different upgraders and furnaces, and no mines in this update, which is interesting. And I'm obviously not going to talk about any of the decorative collectibles or anything either. We're just going to be talking about items with stats, starting off with the Donut Refiner, the first of the collectible upgraders. The Donut Refiner is a small little way up high upgrader that does a 1.75 times multiplier. And this thing, in my opinion, is useless on every front. It's not good for late game setups because the top donut part is collidable, which means that ores just hit it and get stuck. It's not good for the early game because the multiplier is so low and it's a way up high, so it's inconvenient to use. And really, this thing just finds itself in a situation where it's good for literally nobody. So yeah, trash item. Moving on. Next item up is the Lemon Imposter, and this thing is a similarly useless item, but for a different reason. It's got a multiplier of 1.2 times, which on its own is completely horrible. That is basically useless. But this item does have the special effect of making your ores much smaller in size. That being said, that's not very useful because we've already got an item that can do that in the ore sawmill and the ore chainsaw. I would argue both of those are better as well because they act as a duplicator, which gives you an extra little benefit that this doesn't have. The chainsaw has a much higher multiplier, and the only real situation where this thing would be useful is if you need smaller ores as a lowlife who doesn't have a sawmill. I can think of zero situations where that would actually be relevant, so this item once again finds itself being useful for literally no one. And with the only two collectible upgraders of the update out of the way, we move on to the rebirth items, starting with the ore skillet. This item is terrible. No, being serious for a second, this is a life 753 item, and it's got a 7 times base multiplier, 3 times if ores are on fire. This isn't super good, you're obviously not going to be seeing it in any late game setups, but for where you can get it, I think this is a decent enough upgrader. It just serves as another extra little multiplier for once you are in those sort of mid-early lives. Nothing too special, but I think it does its job and it's a fine upgrader, so it gets a pass from me. You're obviously never going to catch me using it though. Moving on though to the next and only other rebirth upgrader in this update, we've actually got a new decimal rebirth item, which is pretty nice to see. We've got the Turtle Dignifier, a life 4000 rarity 0.3 item. Now you might think that because of this being such a high life requirement and being one of the rarer of the decimal rebirth items, it would actually be a pretty solid item, right? It could be a really good upgrader. It's not. It's an 8 times multiplier, and it's supposed to have a special effect where it gives ores a temporary shield when they have the wet effect, but that special effect isn't in the game right now, and even if it was in the game, this thing would not be very good, and an 8 times multiplier is pretty trash. Bad MPU, and for when you can get this, it's not good. Oh, and I forgot to mention, you might have noticed it's a raised conveyor, which just makes it terrible. I really think this item could use a slight buff or a slight adjustment, because right now, it's just not good at all. That being said, I do appreciate there being a new decimal rarity item. It was fun to grind for, so I do like that aspect of it. Everything else is bad. Moving on to the two Evo Reborns of the update, we've got the Vortex Singularity. This is a hydraulic item that gives your ores a 9 times multiplier and the anti-gravity effect. I don't think I need to say much more. Next up, we've got the Auroral Metropolis, which I still cannot properly say the name of. This really cool looking upgrader, ahaha, is a 10 times base multiplier for normal ores and a 25 times multiplier for frozen ores. It takes 8 frigid dystopias to evolve, and this thing is kind of a mid upgrader in my opinion. Again, it's not going to be something that you're ever going to see in any late game setups or anything. It's got far too low of an MPU for that, but I could see this thing actually being kind of useful for people in the mid game. It's not the most expensive craft in the world, and it's got a pretty decent multiplier, so I could actually see a situation where this thing could be helpful for someone. And especially once Third Sacrifice rolls around and a lot of the really powerful fusions and evos get kind of nerfed down, I could see this thing being a pretty solid one. That being said, right now it's kind of a niche item. There are so many other powerful items that you can get that this thing probably isn't going to see a crazy amount of use right now. It's a solid mid item in my opinion. Next up, we move on to the box exotics of this event, starting off with the All-Star set with the All-Star Behemoth Cake. This absolutely massive furnace is a flat 645 times multiplier. No other special effects, nothing crazy about it. It's just a flat multiplier. Now, if you're in the low lives, this thing is going to be a really good furnace for you. Despite the size, the multiplier is actually really good. And if you can get this thing early, this thing can be pretty damn helpful to you. With that being said, obviously this thing is going to be completely useless to you outside of that early game setting. Not only is its multiplier relatively low compared to a lot of other furnaces in the game that are relatively easy to get, but it's also just massive. This thing takes up a lot of space, and at some point the size is going to become a problem. And even with a furnace with a lower multiplier, having something smaller is probably going to be better for you. So this thing is really good in the early game. If you can get it when you're in your low lives, it'll be really helpful for you and giving you a head start. Outside of that, not very useful. Next up, we've got the other of the all-star exotics, the all-star Sundae. This thing is another pretty large item, but this is an upgrader and it has a 15 times base multiplier. And for every 6th ore that goes through it, it actually gives a 25 times multiplier. And this thing is actually surprisingly powerful, especially for just being a box exotic. Despite its size, it's actually, I think, pretty useful. Obviously not useful for me, but I think for a lot of people who are in the early and even the mid game, I think you could probably get some good use out of this thing. And I think for a lot of people, they're going to be finding space for it in their setups. So this thing, in the early to mid game, it's actually a pretty solid upgrader, and I definitely recommend using it, especially considering the lack of any discernible downside other than its size. Next up, we've got the Windforce Shrine, and this thing is a sword giver, which gives you the Wind Force. Unfortunately, it doesn't give you any sort of speed boost, which is kind of disappointing, but it does have a pretty fun special effect where anybody that comes into contact with it gets flung. It's obviously not anything game-changing. You're not going to be getting any real use out of this thing in setups or anything because, you know, it's a weapon giver, but it's got a cool fun effect, and I kind of like it. And now, with all of those items out of the way, we get into the unique raffle box pool of cake exotics. And before I start talking about any of the actual specific items, there is one thing that is kind of a shared trait between all of the different upgraders, which is that they have multiple uses. None of them are a single-use upgrader item. There's one that's a 2-use, which I'll talk about when we get to it, but every single other one is a 3-use. So this means that getting dupes of the upgraders can actually be pretty useful, and all of them aren't just single-use upgraders. I'm not going to mention this for every single one that I talk about because that would get a little bit redundant. I just wanted to mention it before we talked about any specific ones so you knew that that was an extra benefit on top of the other stats of the items. With that being said, let's start talking about them, starting off with the Angel Cake. This is a 6 times upgrader that removes any negative status effects that your ores have, and also it increases in multiplier for all of the effects that your ores have. If they have sparkling, wet, frozen, or the force field effects, they get an increase in 1 multiplier for a max total of 10 times. This is a pretty good upgrader. It's not going to be useful in any late game setups, but if you're in the mid to early game, this thing can be pretty powerful for you. That's going to be a pretty common sentiment. Most of these are pretty good for the early to mid game, but not very useful in the end game. Next up, we've got the Belated 4th Birthday Cake. This item is a furnace item, and it is not good. It has a base multiplier of 100 times, and it has a special effect where if ores are alive for a certain amount of time that's seemingly unknown, it can just not process them and destroy them. So this thing is just terrible and really not worth using at all. It's just a bad item. But that being said, I do like the idea of it. I kind of like the look of it. I think it's a pretty cool item, and I like that they're making a callback to the fact that there wasn't a 4th birthday event. I think that's neat. Anyway, though, moving on to one of the cakes that I actually have, we've got the Citrus Cake. This thing has a base multiplier of 5 times, but if you use the Citrus Enhancer before it, it actually gets a 10 times multiplier. This is pretty decent, especially considering the fact that the Citrus Enhancer is actually still in the box rotation, which gives you a chance to get it if you didn't have it before. So yeah, this thing is pretty solid, and if you can get your hands on the Citrus Enhancer with it, it's a nice little juicy upgrade. Next up, we've got the Devil's Cake, and this thing has a 7 times base multiplier and 8 times if ores are on fire. Nothing too crazy with this one, no super special effects or anything, but it's just a solid upgrader. It's just a fine multiplier. Nothing much else to say with that, it's just fine. Next, we've got another one of the cakes that I actually own, which is the Dragon Cake. And this is one of my favorite items aesthetically in the entire event. I really like the look of it. I like the sort of reddish pinkish color. The dragon vibe is super cool. And it certainly helps that it kind of fits with the vibe of my outfit right now. Anyway, in terms of the stats, this is actually one of the weaker upgraders out of the bunch. It's got an 8 times multiplier, which is pretty good, but it also can set your ores on fire and has a chance of exploding them. So it's basically like a blaster without the benefit of being infinitely loopable. So this thing, while it has a decent multiplier, does have a pretty significant downside, so I think this is a little bit less useful than some of the other upgraders. Next up, we've got the worst item in the entire event, the Forsaken Cake. This is a Far Guild themed furnace which has a base 15 times multiplier. You heard me right, it's a furnace with a 15 multiplier. This can be increased to a whopping 30 times if the player has talked to the Far Guild NPC during the day. So this thing is bad on multiple fronts. Not only is it a completely useless item multiplier-wise, and it's a furnace, but also, it's a Far Guild item. So this thing is just genuinely disgusting, and if I don't get any of the raffle box items, I truly hope that it's this one. Next up, we've got the Honeycomb Cake, which has a base multiplier of 6 times, and the multiplier actually increases for all of the bee or honey The multiplier increases for all of the honey or bee-related items that you used before it, meaning both of the beehives and the honeycomb solace will increase this thing's multiplier by 1 up to a max multiplier of 9 times. It also applies a completely new and unique effect to this item called the hydrophobic effect, which makes ores immune to the wet effect. Kind of weird, and I'm not sure if that's actually going to come into play at all, but the item does give it, which is interesting. Yeah, this item's decent, especially if you have all of the old items, but I really don't see many people having all of those old items and still needing to use this thing. It's decent, it doesn't have any super big downsides, but it's also just not super great. Next up, we've got the jelly cake, which is one of the most simple of these items. It's just an 8 multiplier. Just a flat 8 multiplier. Nothing crazy, no major drawbacks or anything, which makes it one of the better items of the bunch. Next up, we've got the peanut butter cake, which is the one and only upgrader from this group that only has a 2 upgrade use limit. It has a 5 times multiplier and no other special effects. So with this thing having one of the lowest multipliers and a lower use limit, it makes it one of the worst upgraders in the entire grouping. That being said, it has one of the best descriptions of any item in the entire game, so it gets a pass from me. Great item, absolutely love it. Moving on, we've got the last of the cake items which I actually have multiple of, because after opening 3 of the raffle boxes, I managed to get a dupe already. We got the s'more cake, which is an upgrader that has a 7 times multiplier and it sets your ores on fire. Nothing crazy, just a nice simple multiplier. Not a huge negative downside, but still something that you've got to keep in mind if you use it. Yeah, this thing is fine. It's just an okay upgrader. Whatever. And finally, we've got the cherry pie, which is one of the most confusing upgraders of the bunch. It has a 1.8 times multiplier, and then it rounds your ore down to the nearest whole number. It's kind of a pointlessly complicated effect, and it's such a low multiplier that this thing really is just not good or relevant in almost any way. But yeah, there we go. There are all of the new items in this update. There is quite a bit to go through, and a lot of them are honestly pretty useless. Especially for me. A lot of the items obviously aren't going to matter for me. There's nothing that's really going to be added to meta setups or anything. Most of these items are really only going to be good during Third Sacrifice or for people in the early to mid game, but I don't really see that as much of a problem anymore. The old Sky would have been like, wow, where's my game-changing meta stuff that makes the game way easier, but New Sky, who has a slightly different perspective, says all good. I like just having stuff to grind for, and it'll be useful in the future, so who cares? But anyway, yeah, I've taken too much of your time already. This is probably a pretty long video at this point, so let me just shout my channel members, then I'll let you guys get out of here. We got Aeromix, Ninja Girl, Abyss, Atrax, Luke, Gage, Spectoring, Darful, Cosmic Eclipse, Fished, and 1 Maxify. Thank you guys very much for being channel members. Really appreciate you. It means a lot that you're still around. Some of these people have been channel members for a very long time. We got a few that have been around for 7 months, one person, Aeromix, who's been around for 8 months, which is just crazy to me. So I really appreciate you guys, and of course I appreciate all the new channel members as well, people just joining in, all of the new subscribers. We've been gaining subscribers very quickly recently. 10K is just coming real fast. But yeah, I really appreciate all you guys, really appreciate you watching. If you're someone who stuck around all the way to the end of the video, leave a comment that has Doge-chan in it somewhere, just so I know. Just as a nice little code word between you and me for all the 3 people who are here. But yeah, thank you guys, really appreciate it. Love you, hate you. Peace out, everyone.